She had told herself it was a business decision. She had told herself the timing was wrong, the documentation was incomplete, the risk was too great. She had told herself a lot of things in the years since, and most of them had gotten easier to believe. Most of them. Catherine Voss had been COO of Meridian Logistics for 11 years when she made the choice that ended Gregory Hamill's career. She didn't think of it that way at the time. That was the part she could never fully explain to herself afterward. How clean it had felt, how necessary, how much like the only reasonable path forward. She had signed the separation agreement on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon she was in a strategy meeting about Q3 projections, and Gregory Hamill was already being escorted from the building with a box of desk items and a severance check that barely covered a month of his daughter's tuition. She had not looked out the window when he left. She had told herself that was a kindness. Gregory Hamill was 41 years old when Meridian brought him on as a senior systems architect, and he came with exactly the kind of quiet reputation that made hiring managers nervous and good engineers respect him immediately. He didn't have a polished LinkedIn profile. He didn't give presentations with slides. He had 17 years of infrastructure work across rail freight and regional shipping networks, a daughter named Lily who was 8 years old and currently attending Westbrook Elementary, and a photograph of his late wife tucked into the corner of his monitor that he never talked about to anyone. His wife, Joanna, had died of an aggressive form of ovarian cancer 3 years before he joined Meridian. She had been 36. Lily had been 5. Gregory had taken a year off, then come back to work because staying home meant staying in the silence of an apartment that still smelled faintly like her shampoo and still had her handwriting on a grocery list he couldn't bring himself to throw away. He was not the kind of man who talked about these things. He was the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and solved problems other people had given up on. The problem he had been quietly solving for Meridian for 2 years, in addition to his regular work, during lunch breaks and weekend evenings after Lily was asleep, was called Project Linchpin. The logistics industry had a coordination problem that everyone acknowledged and no one had adequately solved. Regional freight networks operated in silos. Handoff protocols between carriers were manual, prone to error, and extraordinarily expensive when they failed. Gregory had been watching this problem for a decade. He had a particular way of thinking about systems, not as collections of parts, but as relationships between pressures. He saw freight movement the way a structural engineer sees load distribution. He understood where the stress accumulated. He understood what happened when it released. Linchpin was a dynamic routing and handoff coordination system that used real-time carrier status data, weather pattern modeling, and predictive delay algorithms to automate the most failure-prone moments in long-haul freight transfer. It was not flashy. It was deeply, precisely functional. In internal testing that Gregory had run quietly using anonymized carrier datasets, it reduced transfer failure rates by 31% and cut average delay costs by a factor that made the numbers look like a mistake. He had shared the early framework with his direct manager, a man named Doyle Marsh, who had reacted with the particular enthusiasm of someone who immediately understood what they were looking at and immediately began thinking about how to position themselves relative to it. Doyle Marsh had been at Meridian for 9 years. He had survived 3 restructurings and 2 changes in executive leadership by being extraordinarily skilled at one thing. Being present at the moment an idea became valuable, and making that presence look like authorship. Gregory had not understood this about Doyle Marsh. He was the kind of man who assumed that if you showed someone your work honestly, they would respond to it honestly. Joanna had once told him gently that this was both his greatest quality and his most dangerous blind spot. He had laughed. He had agreed. He had not, apparently, fully absorbed the lesson. The first sign was small enough to miss. In February of the year, Gregory planned to formally present Linchpin to senior leadership. He noticed that Doyle had begun using the system's terminology in meetings. not attributing it, just folding the language in naturally, the way someone adopts vocabulary they've been using long enough to forget where it came from. Gregory told himself it was unconscious. He told himself terminology wasn't ownership. The second sign was harder to dismiss. In March, Doyle submitted a preliminary proposal to the executive strategy team, a document Gregory learned about secondhand through a colleague who mentioned it casually over lunch. The proposal outlined a new logistics coordination initiative. It described the core architecture of Linchpin without naming it Linchpin. It did not mention Gregory Hamill. Gregory read the summary version that circulated to department heads. He sat with it for a long time. He thought about Lily, who was 10 now, who had recently announced she wanted to be a mechanical engineer, who had been building small motors from a kit he'd given her for Christmas with a seriousness and precision that made his chest ache in a way he couldn't name. He thought about what it meant to spend 2 years building something real and have it disappear quietly into someone else's name. He went to Catherine Voss. He chose her because she was the COO, and because in the 18 months since she'd taken the role, he had observed her to be someone who asked the right questions in meetings and didn't seem to reward performance over substance. He had observed her to be fair. He had been watching leadership long enough to know that fairness was rarer than it looked. And he had concluded, based on available evidence, that she was genuinely interested in how things actually worked rather than how they appeared to work. He was not wrong about that. That was what made what happened next so hard to understand. He brought documentation. He had his development logs, his version history, his original framework documents with timestamps going back 26 months. He had the email chain from the previous October in which he had walked Doyle through the core algorithm. He had everything except a formal internal patent filing, which he had not done because the process required manager authorization, and his manager was Doyle Marsh. Catherine Voss listened to all of it. She asked careful questions. She did not interrupt. She looked at the documentation with the focused attention of someone taking it seriously. Then she thanked him for bringing it to her and told him she would look into it. Gregory went back to his desk. He kept working. He kept being the person who showed up early and solved problems. He kept tucking Lily in at night and listening to her describe the motors she was building and feeling, in those moments, like the world was steady and manageable in a way it wasn't anywhere else. 3 weeks later, Doyle Marsh's Logistics Coordination Initiative was approved for development at the executive level, with a budget allocation that suggested senior leadership understood exactly what it was worth. 4 weeks after that, Gregory Hamill was called into a meeting with HR and a woman named Patricia from legal. The meeting lasted 14 minutes. He was told that his role had been eliminated as part of a departmental restructuring. He was given a separation agreement and asked to return his access badge and laptop. He did not make a scene. He read the agreement. He asked 2 specific legal questions that Patricia answered carefully and that told him, without either of them saying so directly, that the decision had already been reviewed and was protected. He signed. He took his box. He remembered, as he walked through the lobby for the last time, that Lily had a dentist appointment on Thursday, and he needed to reschedule it because he had assumed he would be at work. The logistics of being a single parent did not pause for professional devastation. That was something you learned. He did not look back at the building when he reached the parking lot. He did not think of it as a kindness to himself. He simply did not look back. The years that followed were not a story of collapse, though they could have been. They were a story of reconstruction, slower, quieter, and more deliberate than anyone watching from the outside would have noticed. Gregory took 3 months before he looked for work again. He spent those months doing things he had postponed, taking Lily on a long drive up through the Smokies that she still talked about years later, fixing a set of structural problems in the house that had been accumulating, reading the engineering papers he had been saving to a folder on his desktop for 2 years without opening. He did not tell Lily what had happened, exactly. He told her that his job had ended and he was taking some time. She had looked at him with Joanna's eyes, dark, steady, assessing, and said, "Okay, Dad," in the tone of someone understood more than she was letting on. She was 10. She already understood more than he gave her credit for. He gave her more credit after that. He did independent consulting work for 14 months before he was brought on as a systems director at a mid-sized freight brokerage in Nashville called Vantage Corridor. The company was smaller than Meridian and growing faster than its infrastructure could support. Gregory had seen that pattern before. He spent the first 8 months mapping where the load stress was accumulating. Then he started solving it. He didn't call it linchpin. He built the core principles from scratch. Formally this time, with full documentation, registered under his name with the company's legal team, before he wrote a single line of implementation code. The company's general counsel, a patient woman named Adele who had seen enough intellectual property disputes to find Gregory's thoroughness deeply reassuring, told him it was the most well-documented system architecture she'd seen submitted for internal protection in her entire career. "Most engineers don't think about this part until after something goes wrong," she said. "I know," Gregory said. He didn't elaborate. The system worked. It worked significantly enough that Vantage Corridor's operational efficiency numbers drew attention from freight industry analysts within 2 years. It worked significantly enough that Gregory was promoted to VP of Operations, a title he accepted without ceremony, and continued doing the same work he had always done. He hired good people. He explained his reasoning. He gave credit explicitly, and often. Lily, who was 14 by then, told him once that she liked how he ran things. He asked how she knew how he ran things. "You talk about your team like they're people," she said, as if this were an unusual quality that deserved acknowledgement. He thought about that for a while. It was Lily who suggested Nashville for the conference. She was 21 and finishing her 3rd year of aerospace and mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech, and she had been accepted to present a research paper on structural load modeling at the National Transportation Engineering Symposium, an academic conference that Gregory would have been proud of regardless of the venue. But the venue happened to be the Nashville Convention Center, but 12 minutes. 12 minutes from his office. He took the afternoon off to attend her presentation. She stood at the front of a medium-sized conference room and spoke about load distribution in high-variable transport systems with the particular composure of someone who had grown up watching a quiet man solve hard problems and had absorbed, without being explicitly taught, that substance required no performance. She was 21, and she looked like Joanna, and she spoke like herself, which was its own distinct thing, and Gregory sat in the 3rd row and kept his face neutral and did not entirely succeed. After the presentation, there was a reception on the lower level. Coffee and the kind of finger food that conference centers serve at 4 in the afternoon when no one is quite sure if it counts as a snack or an early dinner. Gregory was standing near the window with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, listening to Lily talk to one of her professors when he saw her. Catherine Voss was standing 40 feet away, near the registration desk, talking to someone in a conference lanyard. She looked different, not older exactly, but settled differently, like a person who has been carrying something for a long time and learned to carry it, without showing it, in their posture. Her hair was shorter. She was dressed the way senior executives dress at industry events, when they're trying to look approachable and not entirely succeeding. Gregory recognized her in the same moment she turned her head and recognized him. The moment lasted approximately 3 seconds and contained, on Gregory's side, something that was not anger and not grief and not satisfaction. Something closer to the particular clarity you feel when a long-standing question finally has a face attached to it again. He had not thought about Catherine Voss often in the past 12 years. He had thought about Doyle Marsh less than he expected, and Catherine Voss even less than that. He had thought, more than either of them, about the version of himself who had trusted the process and handed over his documentation and waited. He had spent some time being angry at that version of himself. He had eventually stopped. It had taken longer than he would have preferred. He watched her cross the room toward him. He waited. "Gregory," she said. Her voice was composed. Her expression was not. "I didn't know you'd be. I didn't realize you were in Nashville." "I've been here for a while," he said. "My daughter's presenting." He nodded toward Lily, who was still talking to her professor, and hadn't noticed any of this. Catherine Voss looked toward Lily. Something moved across her face that Gregory couldn't quite read. "She's yours," Catherine said. It wasn't a question. "She is," he said. There was a pause. Not an uncomfortable one, exactly. The kind of pause that exists when two people are both aware of the same large unspoken thing and are deciding independently whether to name it. "I owe you an explanation," Catherine said. I know it's late. I know that's an understatement." Gregory looked at her evenly. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "It's done. I know it's done." She looked at him directly. "I still owe you one." He considered this. He had not anticipated this conversation. He had imagined it in the early years many times and in many configurations, most of them satisfying in ways that the real ocean, standing in a conference center near a table of mediocre canopies, was not quite matching. The imagined versions had a resolution. This felt like something older and more complicated. "All right," he said. "Then explain." She explained in the way someone explains something they have rehearsed without meaning to, in the half-formed, interrupted, honest way that comes from having turned a thing over in your mind so many times that when you finally say it out loud, the words arrive already worn. She had known. That was the first thing she said, and she said it without preamble. She had reviewed his documentation. She had reviewed Doyle's proposal. She had understood, within 48 hours of their meeting, that what Gregory had brought her was real, and that what Doyle had submitted was not original. She had made a calculation. The Linchpin Initiative, Doyle's version of it, the version with Doyle's name on it, was already in front of the CEO and 2 board members. It had already generated excitement at a level that Catherine, as COO, had direct interest in maintaining. Unwinding the attribution would have meant a confrontation with Doyle, a formal investigation, a delay in a project that leadership was excited about, and a public acknowledgement that the company's intellectual property controls had failed. It would have been the right thing to do. It would have been expensive. She had chosen the less expensive option and told herself, in the way that reasonable people tell themselves unreasonable things, that Gregory was talented enough to land on his feet, that the severance was fair, that the system had worked in the way that systems sometimes work, imperfectly but not catastrophically, and sometimes you had to accept that. She had not looked out the window when he left the building. She had told herself that was a kindness. "I've thought about it many times," she said. "I don't expect that to mean anything to you. I'm aware that's about my conscience, not your situation." Gregory was quiet for a moment. Around them the reception continued, conversations and coffee cups and the particular ambient noise of professional gatherings. "What happened to Doyle?" he asked. She paused. He was let go 3 years later. Performance issues. The initiative, the one built on your framework, it underperformed significantly because the implementation team didn't have your foundational documentation. They were building on a summary they didn't fully understand. It cost the company a great deal. She looked at the floor briefly, then back at him. "Which is not justice." "I'm aware it's not justice." "No," Gregory said. "It's not. I stepped down from the COO role 2 years ago." She said, "I'm consulting now, independently." She said this without self-pity, which he noted. "I don't know if that's relevant. I suppose I wanted you to know the shape of what happened after." "Why?" he asked, not unkindly. She considered the question seriously. "Because I think you built something real, and I think you deserve to know it was recognized, even after the fact. Even by someone who didn't act on that recognition when it mattered." She met his eyes. And because I've been carrying around an explanation for 12 years that I never got to give, and I'm tired of carrying it." Gregory looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. "I built it again," he said. "Advantage corridor. Properly this time. Registered, documented, protected. It's been running for 7 years." He said this not to wound her and not to comfort her. He said it because it was true, and because he had learned, in the years since Meridian, that truth told plainly was usually more useful than truth told for effect. Something crossed Catherine Voss's face. Relief, he thought, or something adjacent to it. The relief of someone who has been carrying a version of someone else's story in which things ended badly, and has just been told they ended otherwise. "I'm glad," she said. And then, "I'm sorry, genuinely. For what it's worth now." "It's worth something," he said. He meant it. He was not certain he meant it until after he said it, and then he found that he did. Lily appeared at his elbow. A few minutes later, Professor dispatched, a plate of canapes in one hand and the particular expression she wore when she was pretending not to be curious about something. "Who's that?" she asked, nodding toward Catherine, who had moved back toward the registration area. "Someone I used to work with," Gregory said. "A long time ago." Lily looked at him with Joanna's steady dark eyes. Good long time ago or bad long time ago? He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things. "Complicated," he said. "The kind that takes a while to sort out what it was." Lily nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer, which surprised him, and then handed him half the plate of canapes, which did not. "Your talk was excellent," he said. "I know," she said. She was 21, and she had Joanna's eyes and her own particular confidence that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with who she had always been. "Did you eat lunch?" "I had coffee, Dad. That's not a nutritional assessment. It absolutely is." She steered him toward the food table with the brisk authority of someone who had, at some point in the past decade, quietly become the person in the household who kept track of whether the other one was taking care of himself. He had not noticed exactly when this happened. He had noticed that it had happened, and found that he didn't mind. He let her steer him. He picked up a small plate. He thought about the conversation with Catherine Voss, not with bitterness, and not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular feeling of a file that has been open for a long time finally closing, not deleting itself, just closing, still there, no longer active. He thought about Joanna, the way he still did, in the particular moments when the world lined up, in a way she would have recognized. He thought she would have had a very precise and accurate assessment of Catherine Voss, which she would have delivered with the same quiet directness with which she assessed everything, and that she would have been right. He thought that Lily was going to be extraordinary. He thought this was not a new thought, but that it landed with more weight today for reasons he didn't need to examine too closely. He thought that 12 years was a long time to carry something, and that he had set it down somewhere in the middle of those 12 years without fully realizing it. And that what he'd felt today when he saw Catherine Voss cross the room was not the weight of it, but the memory of the weight, which was a different thing entirely. The conference reception wound down around 6. Lily had dinner plans with her research group. Gregory walked her out to the lobby, where she hugged him in the brief, fierce way she'd been hugging him since she was about 14. No sentimentality, just intention. "Good talk today," he said again. "You already said that. It was worth saying twice." She pulled back and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, the way he sometimes couldn't read her expressions because they were Joanna's, and they contained information he no longer had the key to decode. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and he was. He was aware, in a way he hadn't been that morning, that this was the true answer and not the polite one. That was worth noticing. She nodded once, satisfied, and walked out to meet her friends. Gregory stood in the lobby for a moment. The convention center was thinning out around him, attendees heading to dinner, staff stacking chairs, the particular quiet that settles over a space after it has held a crowd and released it. He stood in that quiet for a few seconds longer than he needed to. Then he put on his coat and walked out into the Nashville evening, which was cool and clear, and going about its business the way evenings do, indifferent to the weight of what had happened inside, carrying him forward into the rest of it.